Herzlich willkommen zu einer neuen Ausgabe von Crop FM. Mein heutiger Telefongast ist Lucy Pringle und es geht um Crop Circles, Entering the Field. Und auch heute kann man wieder mitdiskutieren, auch auf Deutsch, mit Hilfe des Cropcoms, cropfm.at, cropfm.at, das ist die Website von CropFM und dort gelangt man dann sofort in den Chat, einfach oben auf den blinkenden Button klicken. Seht diesen Chat hier ein und gebt diese Fragen sehr gerne an den Studiogast weiter, vor allem dann im zweiten Teil der Sendung. Zu dieser Sendung gibt es einen Newsletter, den kann man abonnieren, gratis von der Startseite. Und der wird circa alle 2 Wochen, beziehungsweise immer vor einer Sendung, oder wenn sich etwas Ungewöhnliches tut, ausgeschickt und ist in der Regel ein Reminder auf die kommende Sendung. Man kann es gerne mailen. E-Mail-Link findet sich ebenfalls auf der Startseite oder einfach an cropfm@mur.at. Alle Sendungen landen nach dem Dreh quasi als Podcast in einem Archiv. Von dort können sie als MP3 und Real Audio heruntergeladen werden, direkt von der Website cropfm.at. Es gibt zu dem Ganzen ein Forum, wird betreut von Valador, Unarmed, Wingman und Eraser. Und dort finden sich immer relativ spannende Diskussionen zu sehr aktuellen Themen, auch Diskussionen abseits ausgetrampelter Pfade. Das Coverbild heute wieder gestaltet von Matthias Töpfer. Es ist wunderschön und passt auch sehr gut, denn es geht natürlich auch um Heilwirkungen, die in diesen Kreisen immer wieder passieren. Das CropFM Shirt ist jetzt da. Es ist kommenden Mittwoch ist es dann wirklich im Kickshop verfügbar und wird dann sofort ausgeliefert an alle, die bestellt haben und die auch schon auf das Konto, das im Antwortmail angegeben ist, einbezahlt haben. Erst dann wird das Shirt also verschickt, also alle, die jetzt schon bestellt haben und ein Antwortmail erhalten haben, und es sind doch schon einige, jetzt nur noch einzahlen und dann kommt nächste Woche so gegen Ende hoffentlich das Shirt. Und man kann es natürlich auch direkt bei Kick in der Feuerbachgasse 25 in Graz abholen. Spendenbutton, last but not least, findet sich am Kopf der Seite bzw. auch im Past Shows Archiv und man kann über PayPal oder Überweisung spenden bzw. kann man mir auch flattern. Und natürlich ein großes Danke an alle, die schon gespendet haben, und es sind auch schon einige Bestellungen für das T-Shirt eingegangen und ein paar Größen mussten auch schon nachbestellt werden. Noch bevor es wirklich da ist, was natürlich ein bisschen unvorgesehen war. Ein neues Buch ist erschienen, Treppen zum Reich der Götter, eine spirituelle Reise. Markus Hinterholzer, der schon auch auf CropFM live zu hören war, schildert seine abenteuerliche Reise von Delhi über Kaschmir in das Herz des Himalaya hinauf zu den Treppen zum Reich der Götter, wo er die dunkelsten Momente seines Lebens durchlebt und erkennt, warum man zuerst sterben muss, um zu leben. Am Ende seiner Suche begegnet er einem geheimnisvollen buddhistischen Mönch, der sein Leben für immer verändert und ihn lehrt, was wahre Befreiung bedeutet. Klingt sehr spannend. Ich habe es schon zu Hause liegen und bin schon gespannt. Und Markus Hinterholzer kennt man natürlich auf dieser Sendung, denn er war auch schon mal live zu Gast zu einer Sendung über die Katara, findet sich im Archiv und war sehr spannend auch. Das beherrschende Thema die vergangenen Wochen, vor allem abseits des Mainstreams, aber auch dort ist es sehr ausführlich behandelt worden. Hunderte tote Tiere, tausende tote Tiere teilweise, Fische, Frösche, Vögel, auf Grenzwissenschaft aktuell findet man auch einige Artikel. Und gerade jetzt wieder erneut hunderte tote Vögel in den USA. Erneut sorgt in den USA der Fund hunderter toter Vögel für Aufregung. Laut Medienberichten sind nun auch im Bundesstaat Alabama rund 300 Sterlinge tot vom Himmel gefallen. Ähnliche Funde gab es in den Wochen zuvor bereits in Arkansas, Louisiana, Kentucky, aber nicht nur in den USA, auch in Schweden und Italien wurde heuer bereits über mysteriöse Vogelsterben gerätselt. Wie gesagt, es bezieht sich nicht nur auf Vögel, es sind auch sehr viele Fische betroffen, kann natürlich auch mit der Ölpest zusammenhängen, wer weiß. Es gibt auch eine Google Map, wo also diese ganzen Orte angezeigt sind und es sind noch viele mehr, als ich hier jetzt erwähnt habe. Das Ganze klingt wirklich so unangenehm biblisch, muss ich sagen. Ja, die Sonne ist ja wieder erwacht und Forscher erwarten geomagnetische Störungen in diesem Jahr. Der Höhepunkt dieser hochaktiven Phase werde Mitte 2013 erwartet, erläuterte Joe Kunches vom Zentrum für Wettervorhersagen der US-Raumfahrtbehörde NASA. Die Sonne wechselt ihre Aktivität in einem Zyklus von etwa 11 Jahren. Nach dem Ende der in den 90er Jahren begonnenen Phase relativer Ruhe erwarten die Forscher nun verstärkte Aktivität, die sich mit einer Häufung von Sonneneruptionen bemerkbar macht. Eine weitere Folge sind natürlich elektromagnetische Störungen, auch hier auf der Erde, und Felder, die, wie sich immer mehr herausstellt, auch Menschen beeinflussen. Und auch in der heutigen Sendung wird es natürlich um derartige Effekte gehen, athermische Effekte möchte ich hervorheben, auch wenn die beteiligten Felder ganz andere Ursprünge haben. Traut den Augen nicht, da gab es jetzt schon lange keine neue Ausgabe, jetzt gibt es wieder eine. Ich habe die 72-jährige Anni Tilg interviewt und sie berichtet in diesem Clip unter anderem über eine schwebende Pyramide, die sie also 1983, glaube ich, oder Anfang der 80er Jahre vor ihrem Haus beobachtet hat, was also wirklich eine sehr mysteriöse Sichtung war. Auf die geht sie hier ein bisschen näher ein und dann natürlich die üblichen Lichtkugeln, und die rüstige Pensionistin hat mir am 28.12. dieses Interview gegeben und ich spiele hier wie immer einen kleinen Auszug und das gesamte Interview ist dann wie immer vom Archiveintrag dieser Sendung verlinkt, beziehungsweise werde ich es dann auch in die Clips-Sektion stellen. Hier ist also Anni Tilg und ein kurzer Ausschnitt aus unserem Gespräch.
Erst dachte ich, ein Hubschrauber kann es nicht sein. Das war, also sowas, man hat sowas noch nicht gesehen. Und was das nun? Ich dachte, irgendwas muss doch sein, dachte ich. Vielleicht hat so davon Überirdische oder was. Aber man denkt so, ja. Aber ich konnte ja nicht sagen, wie und was. Man hat ja keine Ahnung.
Und was für ein Gefühl hatten Sie, als Sie dieses Objekt sahen?
Es war aufregend, weil die Zeit war ein bisschen zu kurz. Das Gefühl war ein bisschen komisch, ja.
Hatten Sie irgendwie Angst? Oder ich meine,
nee, Angst hatte ich nicht. Ich hatte keine Angst.
Ihre Tochter auch nicht? Also,
die hatte auch keine. Nee, das war wie ein Erlebnis gewesen.
Okay.
Da haben wir noch lange drüber gesprochen, immer.
Ja, das war also Anni Tilg mit ihrem Erfahrungsbericht. Und hier geht es ja gleich weiter mit Lucy Pringle. Viele Menschen, die Kornkreise besuchen, berichten ja von ungewöhnlichen Empfindungen und Erfahrungen, ja manchmal sogar Einsichten, die im Feld der Kreise auf sie einströmen. Ich kann das aus eigener Erfahrung übrigens nur bestätigen. Lucy Pringle beschäftigt sich im Rahmen ihrer Untersuchungen dieses faszinierenden Phänomens vor allem auch mit EM-Feldern, die oft in unmittelbarer Umgebung von Kornkreisen gemessen werden. Sie ist daneben auch eine Expertin auf dem Gebiet der Effekte von EM-Feldern auf lebende Organismen, ein Gebiet, mit dem sich auch Biophysiker wie zum Beispiel Dieter Bröers beschäftigen und das sehr viele Facetten hat. Betreten wir also das Feld mit meinem Gast Lucy Pringle live aus Hampshire. Jetzt gleich, live auf Crop FM. Und im Hintergrund hören wir uns einen Track von Ignaz. Lucy Pringle wurde in England, Frankreich und der Schweiz ausgebildet und verbrachte neben ihren umfangreichen Reisen auch 12 Jahre in Jamaika. Sie ist Gründungsmitglied des Center for Crop Circle Studies. Ihr Hauptgebiet ist die Erforschung der Effekte von EM-Feldern auf lebende Systeme. Sie absolvierte schon zahlreiche Auftritte in Radio und Fernsehen und ist Autorin mehrerer Bücher zum Thema Kornkreise und heute Abend live zu Gast auf Crop FM. Hello, Lucy.
Oh, hello.
Hi. Well, it seems like yesterday that we met in the Whitefield Formation in August of last year.
Yes.
And that was a beautiful formation.
It was an extraordinary formation, wasn't it? It was so enormous, and when I was in there, I hadn't seen it from the air. And when you look at these things from the ground, it's very, very hard to try and figure out what they look like. You just see the flattened crop, and you see the way the crop is laid, and you walk around the directions, and you feel the crunch. When it's new, you feel that lovely sound, the crunch, don't you, as you tread on it. But as to what it actually looks like, it's impossible to tell.
Yeah, it's totally impossible to tell when you are in the formation, but from the sky, it was a very intriguing image that was projected.
It suddenly all comes to life, doesn't it?
Yes, and it was dubbed the egg slicer, I think, because
yes,
it indeed looks a bit like one of those little machines.
In fact, I've got one of those egg slicers at home.
Yes, me too. Very handy sometimes. And yes, it was beautiful. And as you said, I mean, our interview that we did, I already played in the Wiltshire show last year, but I have linked it up to the show entry anyway again. There you describe that the springiness you compare of the carpet, which is the crop circle, which you only get in a genuine formation.
Well, you only get it in the new ones.
In the new ones, yeah.
Yes, indeed, because the more people that enter a crop circle and they tread on the crop, they flatten it. And you don't get, and all the springiness goes out. You remember I said it was rather like a very special carpet where you got that wonderful springiness and depth to it, and it just seemed so perfect, didn't it?
Absolutely. Now, what were the highlights of the past season for you?
Well, there have been many highlights. I think one of the abiding impressions I got was that many of the formations were very close to sacred sites. And in fact, they went into areas, they appeared in areas that they hadn't appeared in before, even going as far west as Somerset. And this was very close to Bath, this particular one, and it was just by a long barrow at Wellow. And I remember that particularly because it was a very long way for me to have to fly to photograph it. And then I went as far up into the Midlands, to Warwickshire, to one called Guy's Cliff, which was, old Milverton, but it was very, very close to an ancient house or castle called Guy's Cliff Castle. And the story behind that is that it is a very haunted house. Well, it's only in ruins now. And the story goes that, in fact, it goes back to the Domesday Book, but it was owned by somebody called Guy of Warwick, and one thinks that possibly he was responsible for building Warwick Castle. But he was a great traveller, and he used to go on these long, long voyages all over the world. And one time he came back, but he hid himself in a cave on the estate. And just before he lived there for many years in this cave, and just before he died, he reappeared. And his wife saw him, and she was in such distress that about all this that she rushed off and threw herself to death over the cliff. And that's why it's called Guy's Cliff.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well,
but then we had Stonehenge, we had Yarnbury Castle, we had so many, all linked to these sacred places, these sacred sites. In addition to that, I was fascinated by the sort of cubic element to the formations this year. One at Danebury Hill in Hampshire, and there's another one at Clay Hill which looks just like a Rubik cube. And I remember flying towards it, and we could see this sort of square-like thing in the field. And then as you flew around it, suddenly the light shone on it, and it came to life. It was almost as though it had jumped out at you, this three-dimensional Rubik cube. And then there was the Vernon Dean one, which again had a central cubic center to it. There were very many interesting elements, but another one, there were so many. Here we go, talking about really so many. There was the one at Wilton Windmill. Do you remember that? Do you remember reading about that?
I think I've been in there. Yeah,
that was in oilseed rape in canola. The yellow-flowered crop, it was in May.
Okay, no, then I haven't been in that.
Well, it was very fascinating. It was what I call a really teasing formation, because so many people came up with different ideas. Andreas Müller, who is a very renowned German researcher,
yeah, I know him.
He likened it to a hermetically sealed computer hard drive, and he showed us how the image showed the data on a hard drive platter, and that was a fascinating thought. Then somebody else likened because it was a circle, and it was divided into, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think it was divided into 10 segments, and each of those segments had tiny little bars on the left and tiny little bars on the right. And many people likened that to a very ancient alphabet called the Ogham alphabet. And that's thought to have been brought to Great Britain by the Celts, who apparently originated in Assyria, and then they went to Mesopotamia, which is Iraq, before actually coming to England. And it was thought to be a secret way of communicating, and they would draw a bar, a straight bar, and they'd have these little tiny lines either side in groups or in different angles. And it was thought to be a secret language of communication, and they would draw it, carve it into wood, or they'd probably do it into stone as well. Of course, the wood wouldn't have survived, but the stone has. And then I think the next and possibly the most fascinating idea was that it was Leonhard Euler's very famous equation. Now, Euler was Russian-born, and he enjoyed mathematics to the extent of just playing with math. Everything he did, he translated into math. I think if he'd gone fishing, he would have worked out the angle of the casting of his rod, and etc., etc. And his theorem is supposed to be one of the most magical in the whole of the mathematical scene. And a good friend of mine, Jim Lance, he spent a long, long time working on this, and it ended up by being a closer approximation, because the Euler theorem is e to square root of 1, pi plus 1 equals 0. And in the crop circle, it was e to the power of high pi 1 equals 0. So h became redundant, and also the brackets became redundant because high was in a bracket. But then a friend of mine, Linda Moulton Howe, got frightfully excited and said, oh, but high relates to Planck's theorem. Now, Planck's theorem is another complicated one. So this is the part of the fascination and the joy of this phenomenon, Tariq, because it gets everybody's minds working. And I think this is where it's teaching us to think outside the box. And no matter how wacky your ideas may be to start with, there's usually some little pearl of truth or some foundation to one's idea.
And this last formation that you talked about, the Wilton formation, yeah?
It was at Wilton, and it appeared in May, and it was just underneath the Winton windmill, which is a very famous windmill, and you couldn't see it from the ground. And it had appeared over a weekend when, in fact, the windmill was closed, so nobody could have gone up to the windmill and seen it from there. It was only spotted by somebody flying over it. And I woke up very early one morning at about 4 o'clock, and you know it gets light so early. And I couldn't get back to sleep, so I thought, well, what the hell, I'll get up, and I'm going to go and see this formation for myself. So I drove all the way down to Wiltshire from Hampshire, where I live, and it had been raining quite heavily that night, and I'd forgotten that the yellow flowers retain an awful lot of water. And also, stupidly, I'd forgotten to bring my photograph. So I went into the field, and I walked and walked and walked, and I got absolutely soaked to the skin, and my Wellington boots filled up with water. And luckily I brought my mobile with me, so I thought, well, I'll call several people, I'll telephone several people on my mobile, and they can tell me where it is. Anyhow, that was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and of course nobody wanted to be woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning. So I went on. And eventually, a lovely man called Julian Gibson, he answered my telephone, and he said, oh, you go in such and such a place, which I did. Went in and I found it immediately. And the outside rim, it had been quite trampled, and oilseed breaks very, very easily. But it was a fascinating sort of crisscross herringbone lay to it. It was quite amazing. But I knew that I wouldn't find what I was looking for in an area where a lot of people had been. So I went in, and I found exactly what I wanted. I found a stem. It was so high, Tarek. It was about 5 foot high. The stems of the plant, and I'm only 5'4", so you can imagine the water was dripping down my neck and everywhere. I was soaked, and I found this stem which was bent absolutely flat to the ground. Now that is a really good sign, because with oilseed rape, it's a very hollow-stemmed crop. And if you bend it at an angle of more than 40 degrees, it snaps. And it's very, very obvious. Also, you can get ones that look flat, but if you go look underneath, you can see they're cracked underneath. So I got out. I didn't have a trowel with me or anything, but I dug around the base of this stem, and I looked very, very carefully underneath. It was perfect, no cracks or anything. So I got out my camera, but you know, when your hands are muddy and they're slippery and they're wet, it was almost impossible to take a picture, but I did. And I pulled up the root and I brought it home, and that was really, really remarkable. I was very, very happy with that formation, even though I was soaking wet. And I got to the car and I took off my sweater and everything, and I put on a very long jacket which came down to my knees, so I could then take off my jeans. I did a real strip, and I thought to myself, I just hope nobody stops me on the way home.
One of the most fascinating informations for me...
I can hardly hear you, Tarek.
One of the most fascinating informations for me was the Turin Shroud, which was actually consisting of two formations, which were on each side of the M4 motorway.
Yes.
And the fascination was not so much because of the overlay that then resulted in an image that reminded a lot of people on the Turin Shroud. It reminded me on the face on Mars, so whatever. But the really fascinating thing about this circle was that the minute I entered it, I have entered formations before where I, felt something, but this one was, I can't compare it to any other one. We had a medium from Cornwall with us who then did a spontaneous channeling, which was very fascinating, I think. And all three of us, no one was untouched, everyone in his own way. I was very agitated. Walter, my friend, he was he had to leave it. He had to leave the formation because it was just too much for his system. He couldn't cope with this specific frequency.
Tarek, I would very much like you and your friend Walter to fill in a questionnaire for me, because this is really how I progress with my research. And indeed, a lot of people, this has happened many times before. I was taking a group of people into one, I think, at Auburn, and after a short time round, I said to them, listen, I'm terribly sorry. I'm going to have to leave. I'm going to have to get out of the formation. I don't feel well. And I said, anybody else who doesn't feel well, please don't hesitate to come out. And when I got to the edge, there was a girl standing outside who'd been part of the group. And I said, oh, why are you standing here? And she said, I couldn't go in. She said, I started to go in. I felt so terrible, I had to come out right away. And she said, I thought, well, maybe I was being silly. So I tried again and had to come out right away. And it's a quite extraordinary thing, because these effects can happen remotely. Quite often when I've been giving talks, people have become either very sensitive to certain formations and find they have to close their eyes, that they can't stand them, or other people have actually been healed.
Yeah, you told me about a young lady, I think,
That's
with arthritis, which we can touch later on. But now that you mention your questionnaire, that is one of the main tools in your research into the effects of electromagnetic fields on human systems or organic systems.
Yes, it certainly is, Tarek, because I think I've got the largest database in the world on this particular area of research.
And me and Walter, we will be happy to contribute to it,
I
of
would
course.
be most grateful, because the way it works is that I'm so grateful for people, because it's a questionnaire which takes a little bit of time to fill in, and all the questions there are particularly relevant, even though they may not seem to be. And when we analyze these, if I have quite independent reports of maybe 6 or 7 people all telling me the same thing, I then say to myself, well, right, something is happening, and I must try and find out if there's a scientific basis for what is occurring to these people. And this has led me on from one investigation into the next, into looking at brainwaves, into looking at the endocrine system, the hormone results, into looking at the brainwaves, into all manner of different areas of research. And so it's due to all the kind people for whom I have amazing gratitude who have kindly submitted these forms.
And now, can you sum up your work that you did regarding the effects of electromagnetic fields, and maybe also how, now, do I understand you correctly that you came to look into electromagnetic fields because of the effects that some crop circles had on people, or were these two parallel lines of investigations that suddenly came together?
It all developed in 1990, when in fact it was an experience that I had personally, and that takes us back, as I say, to 1990 in the very early days. And I'd been playing tennis. I still play tennis. I love tennis. And I'd been playing a mixed doubles, and I was standing at the net, and one of the men on the other side hit a really, really hard ball straight at me. And I got it back, but I damaged my shoulder quite badly in the process. So badly, in fact, that night when I tried to clean my teeth, I couldn't even lift up my arm to clean my teeth. And so I went to bed and I thought, oh my goodness, am I going to be all right the next day? Well, in fact, I wasn't, but luckily I had a car with a gear lever to it, so I could use my left hand for that, and I could just keep the steering wheel going with my right hand. And I got to the airport, and I was going to have my very first flight over the crop circle, so I was so excited. And my sister was with me and a friend of hers. And up we went, and we saw the amazing first pictogram in Eastfield. And it was just absolutely astounding. Eastfield, Alton Barnes in Wiltshire, and it just was, we'd never seen anything like it before. And it caught the world news and everything. And then there were 2 other pictograms very close by. It was all the most amazing flight, and I clean forgot about my shoulder. I was just so excited. But as we were driving home, I suddenly realized, oh my goodness, I'm in a bad way. I've got to stop. And we found a little crop circle at Morsted, which was in Hampshire, not far from where I live. And it happened to be on land which was owned by a friend of mine. So we pulled in, and we walked into it, and I had my pendulum with me because I dowse quite a lot as well, and I dowse for the place of the greatest energy. And when I'd found that, I sat down, and it was wonderful. And as I was sitting there, I suddenly realized that a whole lot of energy was pulsating through both my shoulders. I thought, this is most extraordinary. I've never felt anything like this before, and is it really happening? And yes, it was. So I thought, well, I wonder what he's doing. And I lifted up my damaged arm, and I could lift it right above my head. I couldn't believe it. So my sister's friend, Maggie, this is written up in my first book, she had a very nasty condition called systemic scleroderma, which had all sorts of side effects. So I called her over and I said, Maggie, look, this is a good spot. Why don't you sit here? I didn't tell her what had happened to me in case nothing happened to her. And so she sat down and she said, oh, I feel really amazing. I'd love to stay here forever, she said. And I said, well, I've got to measure. I want to dye. I want to do a whole lot of things. I said, I'll leave you there and I'll come back when I've finished what I want to do. And I came back, and there she was lying flat on her back. And she said to me, she said, Lucy, look at me. And I said, yes, yes. She said, don't you realize I haven't been able to lie flat on my back for 15 years? I said, no, you haven't. My goodness me, I'd forgotten. There she was, flat on her back. I said, this is quite amazing. And I then told her what had happened to me. And it was at this juncture that I realized something was happening to people in the crop circles. This was unexpected for both of us. It was quite independent. And I thought, well, this is an area of research that really, really needs investigating. And to me, it was just perfect because I love people. And people have been enormously kind in, as I say, filling out these questionnaires. And I think almost in a way, it's easier being a woman because people will tell me things that maybe they won't tell a man. And also they know that whatever I tell them, if they don't want it to go any further, I've got one or two which are in total confidence, and those will never go any further. And people know they can trust me, and they also know that I won't laugh at them.
That's
and
very important.
Whatever they tell me is good for me, is great.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's very important. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's very important.
You're very, very... I can hardly hear you, Tariq.
Sorry to interrupt you, but it's very important that people have the feeling that they can talk about these kinds of experiences without being ridiculed or laughed at. It's the same with... I used to interview people about their UFO sightings and further experiences, and it's the same thing. I mean, you need to build a basis of trust.
Yes, you do, absolutely. And I think people, well, I've been in this for so long now that they know that it's quite safe coming to me. But one thing led on to the next, and my first idea was to get out this questionnaire. And then my second idea was to bury little bottles of water in formations as soon as possible after they had appeared. And all the scientists, well, not all the scientists, but many of the scientists, particularly in the Center for Crop Circle Studies, all laughed at me. And as I didn't have any scientific qualifications, they thought that I was totally mad. And so I went ahead because on my father's side, they're all very, very eminent scientists and inventors. And I think I've got even though I never did science at school because that girls never did, I've always been fascinated in science. And so I've learned very quickly. And I realized that water was a very, very special substance, not only in its molecular structure, but from the point of view of its behavior and from the point of view that it has a spiritual aspect to it as well. So it seemed to me that if anything was going to be able to record the residual force of the event, it would be water. So I buried these little bottles, and about an inch or two deep, and I'd leave them there for maybe a week or whatever, and I'd come back and we would have to douse for them because, as you can imagine, Tariq, when you go into a big formation like the one we were at White Hill, you think you know where things are, but you come back a week later when people have trampled it, and everything's changed. So it had to be a dowsing exercise. And we found over 90% over the years. But very often I take with me somebody who was not there when I buried them, because dowsing is a strange medium. You have your different levels of consciousness. You have beta, alpha, theta, and delta, all at different frequencies. And you douse the best when you are down in the theta level, because that, I think, is about 5 to 8 hertz, something like that. But it's at a time when your own personality or ego steps to one side and you become an open channel. Sometimes you have to protect yourself when you do this. And so you can heal the best, you receive healing the best, you douse the best. And when I go in, and I think I know where it is, I am in the beta level, and I say to my pendulum, that's where it is. Well, I'm actually in control of the pendulum, and it says yes. And very often I'm entirely wrong. But people who go in who don't know where it is, their ego steps to one side, and they find it. There was one particular instance when there was a formation which had been harvested, and I went to find my bottles, and it's usually easier when it's been harvested. And I was with my sister, and I dug, and I dug, and I dug, and I couldn't find this bottle. I got so annoyed. And I sat down. I said to my sister, listen, you take the pendulum. And she said, but I can't douse. I said, well, I can't find it. Listen, you have a go. Within a minute, she'd found the bottle.
Yeah.
And there you are. Most everybody can douse. So it's not just that we use science. We use other methods as well. In fact, I'm writing a book with eminent scientists. We're going to be writing the science behind the circle and the science behind the crop circles and the science behind dowsing. And there is science behind these things, and it's going to be a fantastic book. So that was really what happened. And then I led on to other things, and I got fascinated in what was happening to people's brains, neurochemical reactions. So we started investigating brain activity, and we found a lot of interesting results, distinct anomalies from the control tests to repeating the tests inside the circles. There seemed to be a terrific pull to the right-hand side of the brain, and also there was something called alpha blocking, which again is very unusual, certainly in a waking state. And it's alpha is really the bridge between the conscious and the self-conscious. It was a very unusual anomaly that was occurring. And then my next venture was looking into the endocrine system, the hormones, what was happening to people's hormones. And we found that the thyroid was quite dramatically affected. And I suppose this is one of the most interesting of all the hormones, because the results that we were getting with people inside the circles, or subsequently after visiting the circles, was that the levels of thyroid dropped to such an extent that you wouldn't have expected to see those results in anything less than 3 months, because the thyroid is the slowest moving of all the glands in the body. And that has been quite worrying over the years. This particular year, we did tests in the Vernon Dean one. Vernon Dean is a marvelous sort of bowl, a huge hole in the ground. Well, a huge area which rather as though a comet hit it. And in fact, it's one of the few places that the Romans, instead of building a road across it, they actually built a road around it. Huge amphitheater. And we did our tests in there, and Hazel Drummond, who was conducting the tests, she'd started conducting some of these tests 4 years ago, and she went in as an absolute skeptic. And in fact, the first year, we did do the tests in a circle that had been man-made. And we got no anomalies at all, and that confirmed to her that all circles were man-made. Well, the next year, we went into the 07 one at Alton Barnes, and I can't tell you what happened to people. That's written up on my website. I've never been into a circle like that before. The following year, so she came out a different person, saying, I now know what it feels like to go into a genuine one. The next year, we did the Pi one at Barbary Castle. Again, that was just extraordinary. And this year, going up to the one at Vernon Dean, she was going first with her equipment. And she got within the electromagnetic fields of the circle, and suddenly her knees went weak and her legs went weak. And she thought, my goodness, I'm going into a genuine crop circle. And she only just made it. And she sat down at a particular place. Now, I had a dowser there with me called Billy Gorn, an Irishman. And he is the most extraordinary man I've ever seen. He dowses with his eyes. Instead of using his hands or using rods or using anything, he purely dowses with his eyes. And you can suddenly look at him and you say, where has Billy gone? And his eyes are looking into the distance. And he came up to me and he said, Lucy, this is fascinating. Where Hazel's sitting, he said there is a shaft of energy going straight up through her body, straight up through her head, straight up. I said, oh, Billy, how far is it going? He said, I couldn't tell you. He said, I can't even see how far it's going. And so he, either side, two people either side, he said, it's going straight up. And then further along, he said, oh, my goodness, this is where it's changed. It was going up and straight down into the ground. Now, several people didn't feel well in that circle. One of the people who actually was acting as one of my guinea pigs, he'd walked up the outside where this was taking place, and he felt dreadful. He said, I'm not going into the center. No way am I going near the center. He said, I think I'll be sucked down into the earth like a water going down a plug. And so we conducted the tests. I buried my bottles of water, and as I was finishing, because I went outside what I called the safe area, as I was finishing, I said to this friend, Christopher Weeks, I said, listen, Christopher, I've got to get out. I'm feeling dreadful. And he said, well, I've felt dreadful ever since I've been in here. And so we managed to get out. But Hazel's thyroid results were very, very, very interesting because there are 4 different types of thyroid, and 3 of them were very, very depleted. And one was, she was absolutely fine, because what we do control tests beforehand at the Avebury Study Centre, then we go into the circle to repeat the tests, and then we come out of the circle, and at the edge of the road we repeat the tests. There are 4 types of thyroid. There's thyrotropin, thyrotropin RH, T4, and T3. All they were absolutely fine, all 4 of them, before going into the circle, in the circle, but afterwards they were very, very worrying. Her thyrotropin had risen quite a bit, but the thyrotropin RH, the T4 and the T3, had dropped quite dramatically. In fact, the T4 had dropped by almost 50%. Now, why had the thyrotropin raised in level and the others had fallen? And it was only looking up the research on this that I discovered that if the thyrotropin is an extraordinary thyroid in that it tries to balance the rest of the thyroids, and clearly it had raised in order to try and compensate for the other thyroids being depleted. This was absolutely fascinating. In addition to that, we did brain activity tests, and again we found extraordinary results. There was huge variation in both the gamma and the delta, and again we have different frequencies because it's gamma, beta, alpha, theta, delta. So you have the, wait a second, yes, so you have the 5 different ones, all at different hertz. And the delta brain waves, they're right, it seemed to be right from the extremes, right from the highest brain waves right to the lowest. The delta is it's interesting. It's been linked to people with very intuitive people and people who have a sort of gut reaction. You know, they sense the dangers around, and so that's when you're in delta. But the gamma brain waves, when you're sort of in optimal thought processes and really sort of high-powered, functioning well. But one of the fascinating things was, one of the most fascinating, this got me so excited, I can't tell you. When you have higher frequencies of beta and gamma, it releases more dopamine. Now, dopamine is a chemical that is often given to people who have Parkinson's.
Yeah.
And what we were finding was that dopamine, it's a monoamine, and it's formed by, it's a compound containing nitrogen formed from ammonia by a replacement of one or more of the hydrogen atoms or hydrocarbon radicals. Now, that may all sound very complicated, but it ties in a way that I can't tell you how excited I am with the results I got from the water bottles, from the water in the bottles, also from this formation. What I use is Volvic water, and I was asked to use this by a scientist friend of mine because it doesn't go above 4 hertz. It's the most constant. And we use the Yara testing system, and this is really analyzing all the trace minerals. Well, what we found this year was something which has never occurred before. There was a huge increase in the nitrate, which seems to happen every time we go into a genuine one. But there was also a huge increase in the ammonia. Now, there isn't any ammonia in Volvic water. There isn't any ammonia in any of the bottled waters. So how had ammonia got there? And how is it linking up with the ammonia that seemed to be present when you had a high frequency of gamma due to the released dopamine? All this was tying together. And Jim Lowndes, with whom I work, he said the first thing to notice is the correlation between the nitrate and ammonia results. It seems as though there's some breakdown of water into its constituent parts, namely hydrogen and oxygen. These molecules then attach to free nitrogen atoms, creating both increased nitrate NO3 and ammonia NH3. So here we're getting a huge link between the effects of the brain activity tests we're doing and the water results. And this is quite momentous. And I was talking to somebody, I was doing a radio program in the States or Australia with somebody, and I was telling her about a friend of mine who suffers from Parkinson's. And she has tried all sorts of orthodox medicine. And so she said to me one day, she said, "Lucy, I'll try anything. I would love to go into a crop circle and see if anything happens." And as you and I know, Tarek, you don't always get beneficial results when you go into crop circles. So I said, well, listen, I'll wait until I find one which I think is really, really beneficial. And the first one I found was one at Alton Barnes called the Taurus Knot in 1997. And she went in there with a friend of hers. They sat in the center for 20 minutes. and she didn't shake once for 24 hours. Now, after 24 hours, the shaking came back. But if you can imagine, I don't know if you know anybody who has Parkinson's, they shake so many times per minute, per second even, and not to shake even for 10 minutes, let alone an hour, let alone 24 hours. That was an absolutely astounding result. What had happened to her? What frequency had affected the area of her brain which controlled the shaking? Now, when I got these results this year about the gamma level of consciousness, which I think goes up to 30 to something like 70 hertz, I said to myself, is there some relationship? What is happening? And then I said to myself, well, Mary couldn't have been in the gamma level forever because she slept, and that would have taken her down into the delta and the theta. What is going on? So this to me is just hugely exciting, Tarek, and this radio interview I did with this wonderful woman in Australia, she knows somebody from the Fox formation who has done extensive research into Parkinson's, and she got so excited about this that she's written to him, and I would just love to be able to continue this area of research, because if only we could help people, it would be just marvelous, Derek. I mean, all this, Parkinson's is the most dreadful condition. A cousin of mine died of it about 3 years ago, and, you know, if we could, the crop circles, in some way, if they could, our research could result in finding a cure for Parkinson's, it would, I would just be over the moon.
I can imagine that.
This is why it's so exciting, Tarek. This is why I stick with it. It's become sort of a passion, you know, and people should have a passion in life. And if you can help people who are sick, would be just wonderful.
Yeah, no question about that. Where does electromagnetism really get into the picture here? I mean, is the mechanism that transmits this information, or let's call it frequencies or whatever, into the water, is the medium an electromagnetic field, or where does...
I think it's the residual effects, because an electromagnetic field is a moving field. So it's the residual effects of the electromagnetic field. But did you ever read my story that I put on my website about the eyewitness report?
No. Which story do you refer to?
Oh, that was an extraordinary event. I don't know if you are familiar with the formation that appeared in July 1996 opposite Stonehenge.
The Julia set, or?
Yes, the Julia set. That's absolutely right. That was a fantastic one, and it was so unusual because it was reported to have occurred during the daytime.
Yes.
And in fact, this was confirmed by a guard at Stonehenge and also a gamekeeper who said it wasn't there in the morning. Well, last year, I gave a talk at Alton College, which is a college close to me. And a few weeks after that, I got a telephone call from a friend who said, "Quick, Lucy, you must go down to Stonehenge because somebody has seen a crop circle appear." This was last year. Well, no, the year before, because we're now 2011. And I said, "But I don't think there is one opposite Stonehenge." And she said, "Well, quick, you must find out." So I rang round, and no, there wasn't one opposite Stonehenge at all. So she gave me the name of somebody who we'll call M. So I rang through, and apparently what had happened, somebody who had been to my talk had been in a taxi afterwards and just happened to say to the taxi driver, do you know I've been to a most fascinating talk on crop circles? And the taxi driver said, I saw one appear opposite Stonehenge. Well, I got the name of the taxi driver and I rang through, and she told me a most extraordinary story. I said to her, first of all, I don't think there's one opposite Stonehenge this year. And she said, oh, no, it was ages ago, she said. So I said, well, there have only been 3 opposite Stonehenge. There was one last year, but that would have made 4, but this was the year before. I said, well, there was one in 1996, one in 1997, and one in 2002. She said, it was 1996, I remember, because my son was in the army, and I was driving down to the West Country, she said, because he was on leave. And she said, I know it was a Sunday, and she was absolutely correct about that, because she said she was driving down in the evening, and all the cars were coming back from the West Country. She said she had almost a clear run. But she said, as she was approaching Stonehenge, you drive down the hill, she said she saw a whole lot of cars parked into the side of the verge opposite Stonehenge. And she thought, oh, I wonder what they're looking at. And as she got closer, she saw this mist hovering above the field, and it seemed to be getting bigger. And somebody pulled out, a car pulled out, so she nipped in quickly, got out, and joined the rest of the people looking into the field. And she said she saw the most extraordinary thing. She said this circle was appearing in the field. And she said, obviously she couldn't see what the shape was, but she said this thing, the crop was just going down. And she said it seemed as though the mist was getting bigger as the circle on the ground got bigger. And she said it was the most astounding thing you've ever seen in your life. And I said, well, how long do you think it took? And she said, I have no idea. She said, you don't think about that when you're watching something like that. You don't think about the time. But she said maybe 20 minutes or something. And she said, then I had to get up, go and leave, and had to leave because, her son was expecting her. So I said, but are you sure about this? Because I said all the other reports I've had of people witnessing crop circles have been in a matter of seconds. And she turned to me and she said, Lucy, I know what I saw. You weren't there. Well, you can't argue with that, can you?
Not really, no.
So I got home, drove home, and I thought, oh dear, everything fits in perfectly, but how can she be so wrong about time? And if she's wrong about time, everything else is wrong. And I then thought to myself, well, all the other reports I'd had were of small, single circles. And this one was 915.5 feet by 508 feet, and it had 151 circles. Because in those days, Tarek, people would go in and they would measure the circles. And this is what we need this year, because this is a vitally important area of research. People are not doing it anymore. It's very, very serious. Anyhow, I said to myself, I wonder if this could be responsible for the difference in time. So I rang through to this scientist friend of mine, Jim Lowndes, and I said, Jim, I've had the most extraordinary interview with this taxi driver. And I explained about the mist, and he got terribly excited about the mist, because when I'd spoken to Em, I said, did the mist come down to the ground? She said, oh, no, it was quite separate to the crop circle. It was way above the crop circle. So I then said to Jim, listen, this time element really bothers me, but could it be due to the fact that it was very complex and very big and had so many circles? He said, of course. Just send me the measurements, the number of circles. He said, I'll tell you exactly how long it took to take. Well, the report I got back just made me so excited. He said, it's generally accepted, I'm going to read what he wrote, It's generally accepted that as a result of work conducted in the 1990s, it is possible to calculate the time a formation takes to appear based on the size and number of circles. The method relates to the Earth's gravitational and magnetic fields. This predicts the velocity of the resulting vortex filament of some 10 foot per second. The filament propagates not unlike a solar flare, repeatedly looping through the Earth's surface, embroidering a gradually evolving pattern. To create the 151 circles in the 915.5 by 580 foot pattern would take of the order of 20 to 25 minutes to create.
So that matches exactly what the witness told you.
In every aspect. And then he goes on to describe the descending force emits an electrical discharge which releases bubbles from the underground aquifers which rise up through the surface of the ground, and the patterns are formed. These patterns develop like embroidery, half above the ground and half under the ground in a sort of looping manner. Now, the pattern under the ground, he said, would dissolve very quickly. He said there's less pressure outside than inside. Therefore, there is a sort of sucking motion from inside which bends or sucks down the crop at the base. The mist would appear to be as a result of cool water vapor rising from the aquifer beneath, and behaves in a manner similar to what happens in the lab when electrical discharges are created through water and different patterns appear on the surface. Mist forms a little distance from the triggering point, which would support what occurred in this case. M could see the circle growing. As for the height, it would be no higher than the radius of the formation created, and the mist cloud would grow as the formation grew. She was absolutely spot on in every aspect of her description. But I then challenged Jim. I said, look, it's all very well. You know, all these patterns, they are so amazingly complex. How can we actually explain away their complexity? And he wrote back saying, however, the more complex patterns have additional information contained in the sphere, and who or what presses the button to make these is not within our present knowledge or understanding. So, you know, the mystery remains. I always believe there's an intelligence behind these. But just to confirm what M saw was a pilot was flying that afternoon from Exeter to Thruxton, and he flew over Stonehenge on the afternoon of Sunday the 7th with a passenger taking photographs of the Stonehenge. And the passenger was a doctor. He was a medical doctor. He flew past it at 6:15. And wait a second. The formation was first spotted from an aircraft at 6:15. The pilot, when he first flew over it with the medical doctor, was at 5:30. And the reason we know that it was first spotted, well, that the pilot first spotted it, was that he flew back. And when he flew back, he found it in the field. Now, he couldn't have missed it the first time. It was the only field opposite Stonehenge. And also, the doctor, he also drove back along there, and he couldn't understand why there were so many cars pulled into the side. Also, the police were called at 6 o'clock because there were so many cars parked opposite Stonehenge, and they were causing a problem. Andreas Müller had happened to talk to the farmer, and he said he had farm workers working in the field until 5:30. So we know that at 5:30 the formation wasn't there because the pilot flew over it and there was nothing in the field. We know it was there at 6 o'clock because the police were called because so many people were gathered there. So we have a time limit of between 5:30 and 6 o'clock when this appeared, which again would fit in exactly with M's story.
Well, that's really fascinating, especially, I've been in the one in 2002.
Yes, that lovely ribbon one.
The lovely ribbon one, and it was I have even an amulet that I sometimes carry from this circle, because it was the first circle where I really, I had to step out and in again just to convince myself that indeed there is something different happening the moment I step into the circle. That was the first time I entered the circle that really did something to me that I couldn't explain. Just a brief question. There is a film out there that I think was taken 97. It evades me where this was being filmed, but it shows 4 balls of light forming a formation within seconds. Do you think that this film is genuine?
I'm not certain if that's the one at Oliver's Castle.
Oliver's Castle, yeah.
Well, no, I don't think it was. And I have to tell you why. The film was shot by somebody who was an absolute expert at videos, and he worked in a lab where you had graphic, and I don't think it was, because a friend of mine who is very clued up, he's a countryman, he said the shadows are absolutely wrong. They're not the shadows that would have occurred at that time of morning when this man said the film was shot. It looked as though it was doctored.
That's interesting. I talked to a lot of people, also to Michael Glickman and I think also Peter Müller about this film, Andreas Müller. Anyway, I talked to a lot of people who think that it is genuine. But
I know, but
anyway.
you have to know about the seasons. You have to know when the sun rises. You have to know about the shadows.
All right.
And this man said, no, this is absolutely all wrong.
All right, so because that wouldn't fit. And now the mist, this is very fascinating. There's mist that, this is water.
It's the water vapor.
The water vapor
up from the aquifers, the underground spring. And this is what happens. There's this release, because as the electrical charge hits the water, you get this discharge of the water vapor. And this is why we'll find that just about all formations form over aquifers, because you get, all genuine ones we're talking about, form over water, because you'll get, and lots of people describe a mist when circles are forming. But this is the first really concise, well-documented evidence we've had, and this is what we're going to be writing about in this particular book. But talking about when he talks about the sucking down and that there's less pressure inside, this is very, very interesting, Tarek, because 2 years ago I got a report from somebody who'd been into a formation in Warwickshire, and that particular day it was a very, very windy day. 2 summers ago, it was a very windy summer. And she went into this formation, and the trees were blowing all over the place, and she sat down and was meditating. She thought, oh, that's strange, the wind must have dropped. And there's no wind inside the circle at all. And she looked outside, the trees were blowing, but there was no wind inside the circle, the pressure had dropped. It's rather like, in the old days when one was flying and you had to suck sweets because you didn't have the same sort of pressure controls that you do in aircraft nowadays, and you could really blow your eardrums.
Yeah.
And so this again is confirming that we're getting atmospheric changes when the genuine circles appear. I know there's a lot of talk about man-made circles, and I know that there are man-made circles. There's no discussion about this. I mean, that is perfectly clear and perfectly obvious. But when you get evidence such as I've got, which show that there can be no human involvement, you just have to say, why are people trying to ridicule this subject when we have all the evidence in the world that there is a genuine phenomenon out there?
Well, it's not the only phenomenon that is being ridiculed, and we know that it's genuine. So
it's through fear, I think, isn't it?
Well, it's fear, and people simply don't understand it. And it's difficult to understand that something causes crop to lay down in intricate patterns and crop glyphs while people can watch this whole scenery going on. We're coming to the end of the show. This show has just flown by. I'm astonished. We have about
good gracious! It seems to have gone on for just for 5 minutes.
No, we just have 10 minutes left, and I have so many questions. So,
all right,
I just wanted to mention Tony Hughes also gave me an account of a similar event that he witnessed, where he had to go into, Wiltshire is all regulated airspace because there's also a lot of military activity there, and you have corridors, you go in and out, and you must not stay there long. You must not stay longer than 15 minutes or so, and so he knows that a circle appeared within 20 minutes or so. I even have that on. I interviewed him again last summer, and in the show from Wiltshire 2010, this can be downloaded. So this is...
Do you remember which circle that was, Derek?
He says it in the interview, so maybe... I can't remember, I'm sorry, because the circles
Could you check on that for me, because I would be really interested.
I can send you the link to the interview. And then
is it in English?
Yeah, it's in Tony Hughes, from the Wiltshire microlight flight.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So, so this is a very common occurrence that people witness the formation of crop circles, and that
it's not a common occurrence. No, it isn't, because we have very few really well-documented cases.
Well, not common, but it's not unique.
Not unique.
Thing.
No, quite right.
And there is strong evidence that a lot of these circles forms in ridiculous times. If you look at the Julia said this that appeared in front of Stonehenge in 96.
The one we've just been discussing.
139 circles within...
No, 151.
51? Okay.
That was the one I was discussing, I was telling you about.
Okay, and then this to appear in 20 minutes is quite an astonishing achievement.
Between 20 and 25 minutes, yeah.
So the link to electromagnetism, Dr. Levengood also did a lot of work on this.
Yes. From
the States, and he said, just by looking at the crop, at the plants, that he thinks that these effects that he witnessed or he found can only be produced by microwave radiation.
That is absolutely true, because it's been estimated that when the force hits the ground, it's a huge electrical discharge of some hundreds of thousands of volts per meter, but only for a nanosecond, otherwise it would burn the crop. And we have evidence sometimes of scorched crop. And then the crop softens at the base, just as though it's a microwave effect. This has been verified time and time again. Doesn't damage the crop in any way, but it changes the molecular structure inside the stem of the crop as it goes up. But one year, I took seeds from inside a formation at Ogbourne St Andrew and control seeds from way, way outside at the edge of the field, and I sent them up blind to be tested for protein levels. And I was absolutely astounded at the results. The protein levels in the ones taken from inside were 40% higher than the ones from outside. Now, how can anybody tell me that there's not a genuine phenomenon? How can anybody tell me there could be any human involvement in that whatsoever?
Yeah, all the different substances that you found in water that you dug in near a crop circle, as well, just as astonishing.
There's a wonderful, I don't know if you know Schopenhauer. He said, this is his quotation, and I think this absolutely fits the bill, Tarek. He says, all truth passes through 3 stages.
Yeah.
First, it is ridiculed. Secondly, it is violently opposed. And thirdly, it is accepted as self-evident.
Yeah, one example is the first flight by the Wright brothers, or that was a post as well, and then every child knew that heavier than air flight, that aerodynamic flight is possible.
Yes.
And of course with crop circles and also the UFO phenomenon.
And how do bumblebees fly?
Yeah, yes, exactly. Good question.
It's the physics. And our ancient forebears, they knew more about physics than we hardly do now because they understood the natural world.
Yeah.
And all physics is developed from the understanding of the natural world.
That's surely the case. I just want to squeeze in a couple of questions that came through the live chat. Crop circles influencing dreams, meditating on crop circles to achieve lucid dreaming, or anything in conjunction crop circles and dreams briefly.
Oh my goodness me! I'll tell you one quick story about that.
Yeah.
Yes, I used to run a little society called UNEX, which was the Unexplained Phenomenon Research Society. And one time I had a wonderful speaker called Dr. Serena Rainey-Dougal, who's had one of the few people to have a PhD in parapsychology. And I asked her to give a lecture about dreams. And she was telling us about how the brain works in certain ways. The brain manufactures melatonin at a certain time of the evening, which induces drowsiness, and then you have pineal from the pineal gland, and you have serotonin. And they all dictate our sleep pattern and our dream pattern, etc., phases of the sleep pattern. And she was saying that quite often you can influence your dream. If you're having a really nasty dream, a lucid dream, you can change it. If you're having a horrible nightmare, you can actually change it, stop it and change it. But she said also, if you really want to dream about something, you can, at the beginning, just before you go to sleep, you can actually state that you want to dream about a certain thing, but you also say, I'm going to remember and record this dream, because so often we forget our dreams. So after the excellent talk, I said to the various members of the committee, I said, shall we all try and dream about what might happen in the fields this summer? And I said, we've got to make this a vow that we'll do this and record it and remember it. And they said, yes, let's all do this. So I went to bed that night and I followed the instructions. And I had a curious dream of a long line of interacting, interlacing circles. And I thought to myself, oh dear, this is frightfully boring. We've got past the linear stage. And I very nearly didn't report it. And then I thought, well, no, I'm not being very scientific. So I rang through to the secretary and I reported this. And I said, I'm not very happy about this. I'm going to try and get back into the dream again tonight and ask for clarification. Well, I couldn't ever get back into the dream, and I forgot about it, Tarek, until about 2 months later, I was flying over the fields. There was my dream underneath me. And I tell you, I almost fell out of the airplane, the helicopter. I was so absolutely staggered. And I then told everybody about it, and I said to the rest of the committee members, did you ever dream about this? And they said, no, we had no dreams whatsoever. So it was almost as though the collective consciousness or the universal mind had targeted one particular person with all its energy, and I was the lucky person.
That's fantastic.
Now, we have so many instances of people meditating and then something happens the next day. I've got countless stories. But also, one thing I'm just going to mention before we go, be very careful about taking your cameras, your mobile telephones, etc., into crop circles, because they may very well fail. But most importantly, don't take in your credit cards.
Yes.
A friend of mine went in with his credit cards. On the way back, he tried to fill up with petrol, and all his credit cards were wiped clean.
Yeah, well, electromagnetism and the residual effects. Now, there's a lot that we didn't get into.
It's an enormous subject.
It's an enormous subject, of course, and but it was a very fascinating account. And I mean, there is another question that we won't get to today. It's why the UK, why England? But there is a lot that has been written and said about this. And I mean, obviously, there's Avebury, there is Stonehenge, and all these sacred ancient sites. So, I mean, that might have something to do with it. The water that you mentioned.
It's all part of the Christmas pudding, if you like.
Yeah, you wrote a couple of books about this subject. I think 4 now, since my audience is mainly German-speaking, native German speakers. Has any of these books been translated to German?
Unfortunately, they haven't, Tarek, which is a very great sadness. Yeah. I hope the one that I'm writing with Jim Lance, it is going to be such a seminal book on linking all these very, very interesting things, the science behind them. I think this is going to be a unique book.
What are your, and that's the last thing we can briefly cover on. We have about a half a minute. What are your plans for next year?
My plans
for the future?
For next year are continuing with my research. And I just hope, this is a terrible thing to say, really, and I'm always very embarrassed about it, but if anybody could send me any donations to continue my research, they would be so gratefully received, because I am entirely self-funded, and I pay for all the laboratory tests, I pay for all my flying, I pay for absolutely everything, and I've done it now for 20 years, and it's such a hugely expensive thing. But it's also important to me, and that if we can get medical help and medical expertise that may help Parkinson's and other things, I think it's just very, very important work.
Yeah, it can't be measured in money anyway. If you can,
it can't.
Help.
But one has to pay for these things.
I know your problem.
I know.
Okay, Lucy, it was a great show. It was a very interesting interview, and well, hopefully we meet again in Wiltshire.
I hope so. Are you coming over this summer?
I might come, because me and a couple of other people, we are thinking about doing a documentary, something along those lines. So maybe I will be there this summer. Who knows? And in any case, I would be very happy to have you as a guest again in the future. And until then, I wish you all the best for your work. And thank you for your time.
Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Me too.
And yes, I hope to see you this summer.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Right.
Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Ja, die Zeit ist jetzt wirklich davon gerannt. So geht es einem auch in manch einem Kornkreis. Man sitzt da 2 Stunden und glaubt, das waren 10 Minuten. Crop FM, das nächste Mal findet statt am 28.01.2011. Bevor ich jetzt da noch dazu komme, bei Bestellung der T-Shirts ist es übrigens jetzt nicht mehr nötig, männlich und weiblich anzugeben, denn das habe ich noch vergessen zu erwähnen vorhin. Das war irgendwie ein Missverständnis, also die sind irgendwie unisex, und dafür gibt's die Shirts jetzt auch in der XS-Größe. Das noch erwähnt, und wie gesagt, nächsten Mittwoch dann sind sie da, und sie sind meiner Meinung nach sehr hübsch. Das nächste Mal, wie gesagt, hören wir uns am 28.01.2011. Zu Gast ist Michaela Fetowski, die blinde Hellseherin. Die geplante Sendung mit Illobrand von Ludwiger musste leider verschoben werden. Sie war aber so nett, hier einzuspringen. Und ja, das freut mich natürlich. Und wir hören uns also wieder am 28. Jänner 2011. Bis dahin. Ja, danke fürs Zuhören und fürs Interesse, und macht es gut.